The Renaissance prince sat in his dimly lit study, surrounded by treatises on power and human nature, yet found himself utterly confounded by a force that seemed to operate beyond all his carefully constructed theories of manipulation and control. Niccolo Machiavelli had dissected the mechanics of political power, had mapped the territories of fear and ambition, had charted the currents of human weakness and strength. But there existed a realm of human experience that eluded even his penetrating analysis, the labyrinthine psychology of female desire and its profound connection to masculine transformation. In the shadows of history, countless men had discovered a truth that would shake the foundations of their understanding, that the most powerful force in human relations was not the crude application of dominance or the calculated deployment of charm, but something far more mysterious and transformative. It was the recognition that true masculine power emerged not from the conquest of others, but from the systematic destruction of one's own weakness, and that this process was inexorably linked to understanding the deepest currents of feminine psychology. The story begins not with conquest, but with surrender, not the surrender of defeat, but the surrender of illusion. Marcus had always considered himself a student of human nature, a man who understood the games people played and the masks they wore. He had read Machiavelli's works with the fervor of a religious convert, believing that power lay in understanding and manipulating the predictable patterns of human behavior. He had studied the art of seduction as if it were a science, cataloging techniques and strategies like a general preparing for battle. But on a rain-soaked evening in a small cafe in Florence, watching a woman across the room who seemed entirely unaware of his presence, he experienced something that would shatter his carefully constructed worldview. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way magazines or movies might define beauty, yet something about her presence commanded attention without demanding it. She read her book with complete absorption, occasionally lifting her eyes to gaze thoughtfully out the window at the falling rain, and in those moments Marcus glimpsed something that made his understanding of desire seem suddenly primitive and inadequate. What struck him was not her physical appearance, though she was undeniably attractive, but the quality of her self-possession. She existed in a complete universe unto herself, neither seeking validation nor rejecting connection, but simply being fully present in her own experience. This was not the calculated aloofness he had encountered in women who were playing hard to get, nor was it the defensive withdrawal of those who had been hurt and were protecting themselves. This was something entirely different, a kind of integral wholeness that seemed to generate its own gravitational field. As he observed her over the course of several evenings, always maintaining a respectful distance, Marcus began to understand that his entire approach to relationships had been fundamentally flawed. He had been operating from a paradigm of scarcity, believing that desire was something to be captured and controlled, that attraction was a battle to be won through superior tactics and strategies. But watching this woman, he began to glimpse a different reality, one in which desire was not a commodity to be exchanged, but a force of nature to be understood and honored. The realization hit him with the force of a revelation. She was not playing any games because she did not need to play games. Her desirability stemmed not from manipulation or artifice, but from her complete ownership of her own experience. She was not trying to be attractive to anyone because she was completely attractive to herself. This was not narcissism or self-absorption, but something far more profound. A kind of self-integration that made her naturally magnetic because she was not depleting her energy in the pursuit of external validation. This observation led Marcus to a disturbing recognition about his own behavior patterns. He had spent years developing what he thought were sophisticated strategies for attracting women, but he now realized that these strategies were all rooted in a fundamental insecurity. The belief that he was not enough as he was, that he needed to become someone else to be worthy of desire. Every technique he had learned, every calculated move he had perfected, was actually an expression of his own inner weakness, his inability to simply exist in his own completeness the way this woman existed in hers. The more he reflected on this realization, the more he began to see how his approach to relationships mirrored his approach to life in general. He had been living in a constant state of reaction, always adjusting his behavior based on what he thought others wanted from him, always trying to figure out the right thing to say or do to achieve the desired outcome. He had been so focused on external results that he had lost touch with his own authentic desires and responses. This insight opened up a deeper understanding of what Machiavelli had actually been pointing toward in his writings about power. The great Renaissance philosopher had indeed mapped the terrain of political manipulation and control, but his deepest insights were not about how to control others. They were about how to control oneself. The prince who could master his own nature, who could act from a place of inner strength rather than outer desperation, was the prince who could never truly be defeated because he was not dependent on external circumstances for his sense of worth and identity. But Machiavelli had written primarily about the masculine world of political power and had not delved deeply into the realm of intimate relationships between men and women. In this domain, different principles applied, principles that were far more subtle and complex than the relatively straightforward dynamics of political maneuvering. In the realm of intimate relationships, the usual tools of power and control not only failed to work, but often produced the opposite of the desired effect. Marcus began to experiment with a radically different approach to his interactions with women. Instead of trying to impress or convince or seduce, he began to focus on discovering and expressing his own authentic responses in each moment. Instead of calculating what the other person wanted to hear, he began to speak from his own genuine thoughts and feelings. Instead of trying to be the person he thought would be most attractive, he began to explore who he actually was, beneath all the social conditioning and strategic thinking. The results were initially confusing and often uncomfortable. Without his familiar repertoire of techniques and strategies, he felt exposed and vulnerable in ways he had not experienced since childhood. He had to face the anxiety of not knowing what to do or say, the discomfort of potential rejection, the challenge of being himself without the protective armor of a carefully constructed persona. But gradually, something remarkable began to happen. As he became more authentic in his interactions, he began to attract different kinds of responses from the women he met. Instead of the polite but distant reactions he had grown accustomed to, he began to experience genuine curiosity and interest. Women seemed to sense that he was not trying to manipulate or impress them, and this created a space for real connection to emerge. But more importantly, he began to notice that his own experience of attraction was becoming deeper and more discerning. When he had been operating from his strategic mindset, he had been attracted primarily to external qualities, physical appearance, social status, the challenge of conquest. But as he became more integrated within himself, he began to be drawn to more subtle qualities, intelligence, creativity, emotional depth, the mysterious quality he had first noticed in the woman in the cafe that he now understood as authentic self-possession. This shift in his own psychology led to a profound realization about the nature of feminine desire. He had always assumed that women wanted to be pursued and conquered, that they were attracted to displays of power and dominance, that the key to winning their attention was to demonstrate superior value through achievement or status or charm. But his experience was teaching him something entirely different. The women who were most attractive to him in his new state of awareness were not impressed by his accomplishments or his attempts to demonstrate value. They were drawn to something much more fundamental: his capacity to be fully present with them without agenda, his ability to see and appreciate them for who they actually were rather than who he wanted them to be, his willingness to be vulnerable and real rather than perfect and invulnerable. This led him to a startling recognition. Feminine desire, at its deepest level, was not attracted to masculine performance, but to masculine authenticity. Women were not seeking to be conquered by superior force, but to be met by equal presence. They were not looking for someone to complete them, or save them, or provide for them, but for someone who was complete enough in himself to appreciate and celebrate their own completeness. This understanding revolutionized his entire approach to relationships. Instead of trying to become attractive to women, he focused on becoming attractive to himself. Instead of working to develop better techniques for seduction, he worked to develop greater self-awareness and emotional intelligence. Instead of studying what women wanted, he studied what he wanted and learned to express it honestly and directly. The transformation was not immediate or easy. Breaking free from years of conditioning and habitual patterns required constant vigilance and courage. There were moments of regression when he fell back into old patterns of strategic thinking and manipulative behavior, especially when he felt threatened or insecure. There were periods of loneliness and frustration when his new approach seemed to be less immediately effective than his old techniques had been. But gradually, he began to experience a different kind of success in his relationships with women. Not the shallow victory of sexual conquest, but the deeper satisfaction of genuine intimacy and connection. He found himself in relationships with women who were not only physically attractive but intellectually stimulating, emotionally mature, and spiritually alive. These were women who challenged him to continue growing and evolving rather than women who simply validated his ego or fulfilled his fantasies. More importantly, he discovered that this transformation in his relationship with women was part of a larger transformation in his relationship with life itself. As he learned to destroy the weak, needy, manipulative aspects of his personality, he found that he became naturally more powerful in all areas of his life. He was less reactive to criticism, less dependent on external validation, less afraid of failure or rejection. He began to make decisions based on his own values and vision rather than on what he thought would gain approval from others. This led him to understand the deeper meaning of the ancient maxim that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. When he was operating from weakness, from neediness, insecurity, and the desperate desire for validation, he was constantly vulnerable to manipulation and control by others. His behavior was determined by his fear of rejection, his craving for approval, his anxiety about not being enough. In this state, others could easily push his buttons, trigger his insecurities, and manipulate his responses. But as he systematically identified and eliminated these weak patterns within himself, he became increasingly invulnerable to external manipulation. When someone tried to make him feel guilty or inadequate, he could examine their words objectively, without being emotionally triggered. When someone tried to control him through anger or withdrawal of affection, he could maintain his center and respond from choice rather than reaction. When someone tried to diminish him through criticism or competition, he could appreciate their perspective without taking it personally or feeling the need to defend himself. This was not the invulnerability of emotional numbness or defensive withdrawal, but the invulnerability of genuine strength and self-possession. He had not become uncaring or disconnected from others, but he had become sovereign within his own experience. He could care deeply about others without needing them to be different than they were. He could love passionately without being possessive or controlling. He could engage fully in relationships without losing himself in them. As his understanding deepened, he began to see how this principle applied specifically to his relationships with women. The women who were most attractive to him were precisely those who had undergone their own version of this same transformation, who had destroyed their own weak selves and achieved their own kind of self-sovereignty. These women were not looking for a man to complete them or validate them or take care of them, but for a man who was complete enough in himself to dance with them as equals. This created a kind of magnetic attraction that was unlike anything he had experienced before. When two people who have achieved genuine self-sovereignty encounter each other, there is a recognition and appreciation that transcends the usual games of pursuit and conquest. There is no neediness on either side, no attempt to extract validation or security from the other, no fear of loss or rejection that would motivate manipulative behavior. Instead, there is a kind of celebratory mutual appreciation, a recognition of rare quality meeting rare quality. This kind of attraction is not based on scarcity or competition, but on abundance and creativity. Each person enhances the other without diminishing themselves. Each person challenges the other to continue growing without trying to change or control them. In this state, Marcus began to understand what the woman in the cafe had embodied that first evening when she had captured his attention so completely. She had not been trying to attract anyone because she was already complete in herself. Her desirability was a natural emanation of her wholeness, not a strategic performance designed to achieve a particular outcome. She was attractive not because she needed to be attractive, but because she could not help being attractive when she was fully herself. This realization led to a profound understanding of the psychology of feminine desire that went far beyond anything he had read or studied. He began to see that women, especially women of intelligence and depth, were naturally drawn to men who embodied this same quality of self-sovereignty. They could sense immediately whether a man was trying to get something from them or whether he was simply appreciating them for their own sake. Women who had developed their own inner strength and self-possession were particularly sensitive to the quality of a man's attention. They could tell the difference between a man who was seeing them as a means to an end, whether that end was sexual gratification, ego validation, social status, or emotional security, and a man who was seeing them as an end in themselves, worthy of appreciation and celebration simply for who they were. This understanding completely transformed his comprehension of what attraction actually was. He had always thought of attraction as a kind of hunger, a desire to possess or consume or absorb something from another person. But he now realized that true attraction was more like appreciation, a recognition and celebration of beauty and value that enhanced rather than depleted both parties. When he approached women from this place of appreciation rather than hunger, everything changed. Instead of trying to get their attention, he gave them his attention. Instead of trying to impress them with his qualities, he focused on discovering and appreciating their qualities. Instead of trying to create attraction in them, he allowed himself to feel his own authentic attraction and expressed it honestly, without attachment to outcome. The results were remarkable. Women responded to this quality of attention with a kind of opening and receptivity that he had never experienced before. They seemed to blossom in the presence of genuine appreciation, becoming more beautiful, more vibrant, more themselves. And this, in turn, made them even more attractive to him, creating a positive feedback loop of mutual enhancement and appreciation. But perhaps the most surprising discovery was that this transformation in his relationship with women had awakened in him a deeper understanding of his own masculine nature. He had always thought of masculinity in terms of dominance and control, strength and achievement, logic and rationality. But as he learned to relate to women from a place of sovereign appreciation rather than needy conquest, he discovered qualities within himself that he had never acknowledged or developed. He found that true masculine strength was not the ability to overpower or control others, but the ability to remain centered and responsive in the face of any external pressure or provocation. True masculine intelligence was not just logical analysis, but the capacity to perceive and respond to the deeper currents of emotion and intuition that flowed beneath the surface of conscious interaction. True masculine attractiveness was not the display of superior qualities, but the creation of a space where others could discover and express their own superior qualities. In this new understanding, he began to see that the highest expression of masculinity was not conquest but service, not the service of submission or self-sacrifice, but the service of creating conditions where life could flourish more fully. When he approached women from this perspective, he was not trying to take anything from them, but to give them something. The gift of being truly seen and appreciated for who they were. This shift from taking to giving completely transformed the dynamic of his interactions. Instead of women being wary or defensive in response to his approach, they became curious and welcoming. Instead of having to overcome resistance, he found that he was being invited deeper into connection. Instead of having to prove his worth, he found that his worth was being recognized and celebrated. The most profound realization came when he understood that this entire process was not really about women at all. It was about his own spiritual and psychological development. The women in his life were serving as mirrors, reflecting back to him the state of his own inner development. When he was operating from weakness and neediness, he attracted women who were either equally weak and needy or who were strong enough to reject his advances. When he was operating from strength and self-possession, he attracted women who recognized and appreciated those qualities because they had developed them in themselves. This led him to a startling recognition about the nature of desire itself. He had always thought of desire as a force that arose spontaneously and then sought satisfaction through external means, but he now realized that desire was actually a form of self-recognition, an acknowledgement of qualities that existed within himself but had not yet been fully developed or expressed. When he felt desire for a particular woman, what he was actually recognizing was not something foreign to himself, but something that called forth and celebrated particular aspects of his own nature. The woman who attracted him was not separate from him, but was somehow completing a circuit of energy and awareness that enhanced and expanded his own sense of who he was and who he could become. This understanding completely dissolved the artificial separation between self-improvement and relationship success that had characterized his earlier approach. He no longer saw developing himself and attracting women as separate projects requiring different strategies and techniques. Instead, he saw them as aspects of a single process of becoming more fully himself, more completely realized as a human being. As this integration deepened, he began to experience relationships not as competitions to be won or negotiations to be managed, but as collaborative explorations of human possibility. Each relationship became an opportunity to discover new aspects of himself and to support his partner in discovering new aspects of herself. Each interaction became a chance to practice the art of loving without attachment, appreciating without possessing, connecting without losing himself. The transformation was so complete that looking back on his earlier approach to relationships felt like remembering a different person. The man who had studied seduction techniques and manipulation strategies seemed like a character from someone else's story, someone who had been operating from such fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of human connection that his efforts were doomed to produce only shallow and temporary results. But he also recognized that the journey through that earlier phase had been necessary for him to arrive at his current understanding. He had needed to experience the limitations and failures of the strategic approach in order to be motivated to seek something deeper and more authentic. He had needed to exhaust the possibilities of external technique in order to be willing to turn his attention inward toward the more difficult work of self-transformation. This recognition led him to a deeper appreciation for the complexity and intelligence of the process he had undergone. It had not been a random series of experiences, but a carefully orchestrated curriculum designed to teach him the lessons he needed to learn in order to become the man he was capable of being. Every failure, every rejection, every moment of confusion and frustration had been serving the larger purpose of breaking down the false structures of his personality, so that something more authentic and powerful could emerge. In this new perspective, he began to see that his entire relationship history had been a mirror reflecting back to him the evolution of his own consciousness. The women he had attracted at different stages of his development had been perfect teachers for the lessons he needed to learn at those particular points in his journey. The women who had rejected him had been protecting both him and themselves from connections that would have been limiting rather than expansive for both parties. This understanding filled him with a sense of gratitude and wonder that extended far beyond his relationships with women to encompass his entire life experience. He began to see that every challenge, every setback, every moment of pain or confusion had been serving his development in ways that he could not have understood at the time, but that were now clearly visible from his current vantage point. This recognition of the intelligence and purpose underlying his life experiences gave him a profound sense of trust in the process of existence itself. He no longer felt the need to control or manipulate outcomes because he could see that the outcomes that emerged naturally from authentic action were invariably more creative and beneficial than anything he could have planned or contrived. In his relationships with women, this translated into a kind of effortless magnetism that was based not on technique or strategy, but on his complete trust in the natural unfolding of connection between two people who were both committed to authenticity and growth. He found that when he approached relationships from this place of trust and surrender to the natural intelligence of the process, everything seemed to flow with a kind of organic perfection that he could never have orchestrated through conscious effort. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when he realized that this entire transformation had been possible only because he had been willing to systematically destroy the weak aspects of his personality that had been preventing his authentic nature from emerging. The neediness, the manipulation, the desperation for validation, the fear of rejection, the compulsive need to control outcomes. All of these patterns had to be identified and dissolved before his true strength could shine forth. This process of destroying his weak self had been the most difficult and frightening part of his journey, because it had required him to let go of familiar patterns and identities without knowing what would replace them. There had been periods when he felt lost and directionless, when he questioned whether he was making progress or simply losing his way. There had been moments of terror when he felt that he was dissolving entirely, that there would be nothing left of him if he continued to let go of the patterns that had defined him. But gradually he had discovered that beneath all the weak patterns was a core of authentic strength that had always been there waiting to be uncovered. As each layer of false personality was stripped away, more of his true nature was revealed. As each compulsive pattern was dissolved, more space was created for spontaneous and creative response to emerge. As each defense mechanism was dismantled, more capacity for genuine intimacy and connection was liberated. This core strength was not something he had to develop or acquire from outside himself. It was something he had to uncover by removing everything that was obscuring it. It was not something he had to prove to others. It was something he had to recognize and trust within himself. It was not something that could be destroyed by external circumstances. It was something that grew stronger through every test and challenge he encountered. In the end, he understood that this was what Machiavelli had been pointing toward but had not fully articulated. That true power came not from the ability to manipulate external circumstances, but from the development of an internal core that was so solid and self-generating that it could not be shaken by any external force. The prince who achieved this kind of inner sovereignty was indeed invulnerable, not because he was protected from challenges, but because he had developed the capacity to meet any challenge from a place of strength rather than weakness. And in the realm of relationships with women, this principle applied with even greater force because intimate relationships had the power to trigger and expose every aspect of weakness and insecurity that existed within a person. The man who could maintain his center and authenticity in the face of desire, rejection, conflict, and all the other intense experiences that arose in intimate connection had achieved a level of self-mastery that was truly rare and valuable. Such a man naturally attracted women of equal development because they recognized in him the quality they had worked so hard to develop in themselves. Such a man could love without possessing, could commit without losing his freedom, could be vulnerable without being weak, could be strong without being dominating. Such a man had transcended the usual games and negotiations that characterized most relationships, and could engage in the deeper work of mutual exploration and growth that was the true purpose of intimate connection. The journey from strategic manipulation to authentic presence, from needy desperation to sovereign appreciation, from weak reactivity to centered responsiveness, was not just a transformation in his approach to relationships, it was a fundamental evolution in his understanding of what it meant to be human. It was a movement from living in reaction to external circumstances to living from internal conviction, from being driven by unconscious compulsions to being guided by conscious choice, from being at the mercy of his environment to being a creative force within his environment. This transformation had been catalyzed by his encounters with women, but its effects extended into every area of his life. In his work, he became more innovative and effective because he was no longer motivated primarily by the need for approval or security, but by genuine enthusiasm for creative expression. In his friendships, he became more generous and supportive because he was no longer competing for limited resources of attention and validation, but was operating from a sense of abundance and mutual enhancement. In his relationship with himself, he became more compassionate and accepting because he no longer needed to maintain impossible standards of perfection in order to feel worthy of love. The man who emerged from this process was not invulnerable in the sense of being untouchable or unaffected by life's challenges, but was invulnerable in the sense of being unconquerable. External circumstances could still bring him pain or disappointment, but they could not destroy his essential strength or compromise his authentic nature. Other people could still trigger his emotions or challenge his perspectives, but they could not manipulate his responses or control his choices. This was the deepest secret that even Machiavelli had not fully understood, that the ultimate form of power was not power over others, but power over oneself, and that this power was achieved not through domination, but through integration, not through conquest, but through surrender to one's deepest nature, not through the accumulation of external resources, but through the cultivation of internal richness. In the realm of relationships with women, this translated into a kind of magnetic attractiveness that was completely different from the manufactured attractiveness of technique and strategy. It was the attractiveness of a person who was fully alive, fully present, fully himself, and therefore capable of seeing and celebrating the full aliveness and presence and authenticity of another. It was the attractiveness of someone who had something to give rather than something to take, someone who could enhance rather than diminish, someone who could love without needing to possess. The forbidden psychology of female desire that had eluded even Machiavelli's penetrating analysis was simply this, that women, like all conscious beings, were most deeply attracted to authentic presence and genuine strength, and that these qualities could not be faked or manufactured but had to be earned through the difficult work of destroying everything within oneself that was false and weak and limiting. The man who undertook this work and succeeded in it became naturally irresistible, not because he had learned better techniques for attraction, but because he had become the kind of person worth being attracted to. And once this transformation was complete, once the weak self had been systematically identified and destroyed, such a man truly could never be destroyed by others because there was nothing left in him for others to attack or manipulate or control. His strength was not dependent on external validation. His worth was not determined by others' opinions. His happiness was not contingent on favorable circumstances. He had become a source rather than a drain, a giver rather than a taker, a creator rather than a consumer. This was the ultimate secret of masculine power and feminine attraction, that they were not opposites in competition, but complementary forces, in service of the same underlying purpose, the full expression of human potential through authentic connection and mutual enhancement. The man who understood and embodied this principle found that his relationships with women became not obstacles to overcome, but opportunities for growth, not battles to win, but dances to enjoy, not problems to solve, but mysteries to explore. In the end, the greatest victory was not over others, but over the limitations that had previously constrained his own expression and experience. The greatest conquest was not of external territory, but of internal freedom. The greatest power was not the ability to control others, but the capacity to remain true to himself regardless of external pressure or temptation. This was what it truly meant to destroy one's weak self so completely that no external force could ever destroy what remained. What remained was pure essence, authentic nature, sovereign presence, qualities that could be challenged and tested but never diminished, qualities that grew stronger through adversity rather than weaker, qualities that attracted the highest and best in others because they represented the highest and best in oneself. The story that began with confusion and frustration in a small cafe in Florence ended with understanding and fulfillment in the recognition that the greatest mysteries of human connection could be solved not through the accumulation of external knowledge, but through the patient work of internal transformation. The forbidden psychology of female desire was forbidden not because it was secret or hidden, but because it demanded a level of personal development that few were willing to undertake. But for those who were willing to pay the price of destroying their weak selves, the rewards were beyond anything that could be imagined from the limited perspective of weakness and need. In this new understanding, every interaction with a woman became an opportunity to practice and express the qualities that had been developed through so much effort and dedication. Every relationship became a celebration of the transformation that had been achieved and a motivation for continued growth and evolution. Every moment of connection became a reminder that the highest forms of human experience were available to those who were willing to do the work necessary to become worthy of them. The man who emerged from this process was not perfect or complete in any final sense, but was perfectly committed to the ongoing work of growth and authentic expression. He had learned that destruction of the weak self was not a one-time achievement, but a continuous practice, that strength and authenticity had to be chosen and renewed in each moment, that the qualities that made him attractive to the highest quality of women were the same qualities that made him effective and fulfilled in every area of his life. This was the ultimate integration, the recognition that there was no separation between personal development and relationship success, between individual fulfillment and contribution to others, between strength and service, between power and love. The man who achieved this integration had transcended the limitations that kept most people trapped in patterns of conflict and competition, and had entered a realm of possibility where mutual enhancement and creative collaboration were the natural expressions of authentic human connection.